The Decade of War study reviewed a wide variety of lessons from post 9/11 U.S. military operations. These operations ranged from major combat to counterinsurgency to humanitarian assistance and others. Understanding these lessons is critical for adapting to the current and future joint force environment. In this short video, we highlight challenges and best practices related to interagency coordination. In the wide range of operations conducted over the previous decade, U.S. government agency interorganizational coordination was uneven due to inconsistent participation in planning, training, and operations, policy gaps, resources, and differences in organizational culture. Similarly, the military was challenged in working with non-governmental organizations, NGOs, types of organizations that interact frequently with other organizations and agencies of the U.S. government, but less commonly with the military. Overall, in the decade following the events of 9/11, U.S. interorganizational partners were unable to harness the full extent of national capabilities to meet requirements early on. Interorganizational action plans were created for some missions, but partnered organizations lacked an overall blueprint for unified action. Over time, military and civilian organizations learned to better leverage each other's strengths and capabilities, despite institutional barriers to cooperation. Coordination with NGOs also generally improved, though relationships remain challenged by a mutual lack of understanding. Initially in Iraq and Afghanistan, interagency unity of effort was a resounding failure. DoD partnering with other U.S. departments and agencies consistently failed to harness the strengths and resources of the respective organizations. Several JCOA studies referenced on the Decade of War webpage for this issue reported that the biggest lesson for the U.S. from the first 5 years of war in Iraq was the inability to apply and focus the full resources and capabilities of the U.S. in a concerted and coherent way. Despite the criticality of establishing unity of effort through a comprehensive approach among elements of the U.S. government for these operations, interorganizational coordination was slow to develop. In Iraq, the notable unity of effort that was finally achieved was largely because of deliberate efforts of key military and civilian leaders that recognized its importance to achieving strategic objectives. In the early years of operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, successes were more commonly seen at the tactical level between elements that were forward deployed. Later, civilian and military senior leaders wholly embraced the need to integrate. These leaders actively forced integration between organizations they needed to partner with and within their respective staffs. Over time, military and civilian staffs learned to leverage each other's strengths and communicate more effectively, lessening the need for leadership to be a forcing function for collaboration. Nevertheless, these deliberate efforts had to overcome institutional barriers to cooperation such as differences between the planning and action-oriented military and the longer-term engagement thinking of the Department of State, DOS, and U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID personnel, each with different missions, led to friction. The military's budget and manpower pools were considerably larger than those of DOS and other interorganizational partners, complicating efforts and clouding responsibilities for areas where DOS had overall organizational primacy, but DoD had the preponderance of resources. Differences in language in the absence of interorganizational doctrine, that is, the lack of established interorganizational coordination frameworks, complicated joint collaboration. There were significantly different abilities between U.S. organizations and agencies to deploy and operate in challenging security environments. Military training focused on traditional warfighting and produced personnel with strong planning skills. Civilian training and education focused on their respective tasks, not in comprehensive collaboration with the military. Despite these challenges, an increasingly expeditionary mindset became resident in a number of interagency organizations over the past decade and more. This progress may be temporary, however, since it is based on experiences and personalities and not on any institutional imperative for integration derived from U.S. law or policy. For some specific missions such as counterterrorism, the U.S. government created action plans that described roles and missions for specific interorganizational partners. While these were useful for laying out how different departments and agencies interacted in general, they lacked specificity. Overall, there was a lack of doctrine or policy specific enough to guide collaborative activities and the achievement of objectives through a comprehensive approach. Doctrine, tactics, techniques, and procedures, TTP, developed and used specifically by separate services, departments, or agencies, were not necessarily applicable in the conduct of needed comprehensive interorganizational operations. In contrast, Joint Interagency Task Force South, JATF South, provides a model for how such interagency guidance could be created. Over time, JATF South developed common TTP across its components by bringing together a group of personnel from different organizations, each accustomed to its own terminology and approach. JATF South created a Standing Operating Procedure, SOP, for their organization that established common terminology and TTP to be used by all interorganizational team members. This SOP also clearly delineated existing authorities, rules of engagement, ROE, and restrictions that needed to be considered in the interorganizational and multinational context. Similar efforts could provide a foundation for unified effort in future operations. Another set of organizations that were present during operations were NGOs. While some U.S. government organizations and agencies routinely work with NGOs, the military often lacked experience working with those organizations, further complicating DoD coordination efforts. Nevertheless, coordination between the U.S. military and NGOs was generally beneficial for U.S. efforts. At the same time, these relationships were challenged by a mutual lack of understanding, the military's tendency to try to be directive with regard to NGO activities, and the desire of some NGOs to remain impartial and maintain humanitarian space to conduct their operations. The value of NGOs, though, required thoughtful consideration of planned objectives, as they can play a significant role. For Iraq, this was borne out by the important contributions NGOs provided for reconciliation and aid to the Iraqi people. Other helpful contributions of NGOs was improving civilian protection during combat operations. In Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, NGOs highlighted instances of civilian harm and brought them to the attention of the military. In Iraq, these were largely instances of escalation of force against civilians from military convoys. The military made adjustments and significantly decreased civilian harm from this cause starting in 2005. Similarly, NGOs and the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA, highlighted instances of civilian harm from airstrikes in Afghanistan, which prompted ISAF leadership to adjust overall guidance to compensate. Some NGOs continue to work with ISAF, serving as a community of interest to advocate for the reduction of civilian harm. Consequently, reporting of ISAF actions became more positive, reflecting progress in this area. In Libya, NGO inputs calling for assessments of civilian casualties after airstrikes were not addressed. This lack of response had a lasting negative impact on strategic communications that affected humanitarian, political, and military objectives. A common challenge in working with other interorganizational partners and NGOs was DoD's normal reliance on the use of classified information. In most cases, a conscious decision had to be made to conduct planning and coordination in an unclassified environment to facilitate information exchange. However, even when done, unity of effort was often still hindered by partnered organizations having limited or no access to DoD networks. The use of non-DoD networks to facilitate needed information exchange helped to overcome this. One example, in PACOM's response to the Pacific tsunami in 2004, was the use of Harmony Web, a collaborative network established on a non-DoD domain that could be accessed by all organizations contributing to the disaster relief effort. Similarly, Southcom made a decision early on to operate in an unclassified environment and employed the All Partners Access Network, APAN, during disaster relief operations in Haiti in 2010. Such solutions fostered information exchange and collaboration between the U.S. government, including but not limited to DoD, and any external country, organization, agency, or individual that did not have access to established DoD systems and networks. The following recommendations shape and better prepare the joint force to address future challenges associated with interagency or interorganizational coordination. Ensure senior leaders stress the necessity and value of interorganizational coordination at all levels of operations. Pursue development of a Goldwater-Nichols-type act to mandate and develop a framework for increased interagency coordination for a whole-of-government approach. Prioritize budgets to appropriately resource the interagency to ensure a whole-of-government approach for contingencies. Continue to use DoD personnel to meet near-term requirements. Develop policies for greater inclusion of interagency involvement in planning, training, and execution to increase partner organization contributions, including expansion of their expeditionary capabilities. Plan for instances where interorganizational integration is critical and evaluate policies, approaches, and information technologies to be used that address identified lessons and challenges. Ensure these lessons can be shared effectively with appropriate elements of the interagency and between interorganizational partners. Initiate DoD-wide programs, for example, interagency exchange tours, to expose military and civilian personnel to a range of partner organizations to better understand organizational cultures, equities, traditional roles, capabilities, and limitations. Promote and improve incorporation of interagency partners into training and education to increase effectiveness of U.S. government efforts and build relationships throughout all levels in partner organizations. Key NGOs should also be invited to participate when appropriate. To learn more about the Decade of War study, read the full report or view additional videos on JCOA's website.